Thatcher Vance is a man who isn't afraid of dying. He is terrified of his own silence. Every morning in the Montana mountains, he wakes with the discipline of a Navy SEAL. Yet he has forgotten what he is truly fighting for. 10 years of service left him with a body full of scars. But the heaviest wound is the silver dog tag he wears, a name belonging to a brother who never came home. He lives in an old van, refusing any hand held out in help. Yet he spends his days guarding a decaying orchard from the shadows. It is not the curiosity of a stalker, but the protection of a ghost paying a debt that can never be settled. Thatcher trains for a war that isn't coming, while his heart surrendered long ago to the crushing weight of survivor's guilt. Beside him is Coda, a veteran canine with shrapnel in his fur, the only one who sees the threads of fate that human eyes miss. Coda doesn't bark at intruders. He barks at the earth itself, where a silver compass spins wildly toward the roots of a fallen king. When the dog begins to sing with the frequency of the Flathead Range, Thatcher realizes this land holds more than just soil and rot. An old Zippo lighter flares with an unnatural emerald flame, bringing the phantoms of the past back into the cold Montana night. Corporate predators are coming with steel and blood-cold contracts, but they don't know they are facing a man with nothing left to lose and a dog who hears the heartbeat of the mountain. To save the Golden Bough, Thatcher must finally face the darkest secret he tried to bury 10 years ago. How far would you go to protect a legacy that isn't yours? Before we begin, tell us which city you are watching from today. We'd love to know how far this story travels. If the bond between man and dog moves you, please like, share, and subscribe to join us on this journey. The dawn in Whitefish, Montana, did not arrive with a gentle glow. It broke over the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Flathead Range like a shard of cold flint. Thatcher Vance sat in the driver's seat of his blacked-out 1998 Ford Econoline, a vehicle he had meticulously converted into a mobile fortress of solitude. He parked on a remote ridge overlooking the valley, where the world felt vast and his own existence felt small. At 40 years old, Thatcher carried the topography of a decade in the Navy SEALs on his skin. A jagged scar ran through his left eyebrow, a permanent souvenir from a rooftop in Ramadi, and his hands were calloused into rugged tools of utility. His face was a study in hard angles, with a jawline that looked as though it had been hewn from the very granite of the mountains he now inhabited. His hair was once a deep raven black, but was now heavily salted with gray at the temples, cropped short in a military habit he could not break. His eyes were a piercing, predatory shade of flint blue. They rarely stayed fixed on one point for long because they were always scanning and assessing exit points or calculating wind speed. He was a man who lived in the silent room of his own mind, a space built to contain the echoes of explosions and the voices of men who had died while he kept breathing. Beside him, occupying the passenger seat with the gravity of a seasoned sergeant, was Coda. The German Shepherd was a massive specimen, nearly 9 years old, with a coat of charcoal and burnt ochre that had begun to fade into a distinguished silver around his snout and eyes. Coda was not just a dog. He was a retired multi-purpose canine and a veteran of 3 deployments. His ears were notched from shrapnel, and they twitched in a rhythmic synchronicity with Thatcher's own movements. Coda possessed a stillness that mirrored his master's. His deep amber eyes reflected a wisdom that felt ancient. He was an animal that had smelled the adrenaline of 1,000 firefights and now chose to spend his twilight guarding, the only soul left that understood the weight of a silent command. Between the man and the dog, there was a bond forged in blood and dust, a connection that transcended the need for human speech. For 3 weeks, Thatcher had been a ghost in this town. He maintained a distance that was both tactical and emotional. He had not come to Montana for the famous fly fishing or the scenic hiking trails. Instead, he'd come to fulfill a debt that felt like a lead weight in his chest. Down in the valley, nestled between the encroaching pine forests and the silver ribbon of the Whitefish River, lay the Thorn Orchard. It was a sprawling and beautiful piece of land, yet it was visibly decaying. The apple trees hung heavy with unpicked fruit, and the fences leaned at tired angles. Through his binoculars, Thatcher watched Elawan Thorne, whom everyone called Elle. She was perhaps 28, though the grueling labor of the orchard had etched a weary maturity into her features. She was lean, and her muscles were corded from hauling heavy crates and wrestling with irrigation pipes. Her skin was bronzed and slightly leathery from too many hours under the high-altitude sun. Her hair was the color of dried wheat and was usually shoved haphazardly into a fraying baseball cap. She moved with a frantic and desperate energy that Thatcher recognized all too well. It was the gait of someone fighting a war they knew they were losing. She was the younger sister of Liam Thorne, who had been Thatcher's closest friend and point man. Liam was the man who had stepped on a pressure plate in the Hindu Kush, so Thatcher did not have to. Every time Thatcher looked at her, he saw Liam's lopsided grin. He heard the ghost of his friend's voice telling him to watch over the girls if things ever went south. But looking at her was one thing, while speaking to her was a bridge Thatcher was not sure his scarred soul could cross. He lived on black coffee and the crushing guilt of the survivor, watching as Elle struggled against a world determined to swallow her family's legacy whole. The morning air inside the van was suddenly disturbed by a low and guttural vibration. It was not a growl of aggression, but a sound Coda had not made since the night Liam died. It was a soft, keening alert whistle that the dog used to signal a friendly presence inside the perimeter. Coda was not looking at Thatcher. His head was cocked toward the empty space between the two front seats, and his tail gave a single, heavy thud against the floorboard. Thatcher froze as his breath hitched in his throat. The temperature in the van seemed to drop 5 degrees in an instant. For a fleeting second, the scent of stale gunpowder and Montana pine was replaced by the distinct, sharp aroma of peppermint chewing tobacco. This was the exact brand Liam used to obsessively pack into his lip before every mission. Coda's eyes followed something invisible as it moved toward the dashboard. His ears were forward, and his body was relaxed, as if he were being patted by a phantom hand. Thatcher gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Not now, Liam," he whispered into the emptiness, his voice cracking with a vulnerability he had not allowed in years. "I am not ready yet." As quickly as it had come, the sensation vanished. It left Coda staring intensely down at the thorn orchard. The dog began to scratch at the door handle with a sudden and frantic urgency. It was not just a suggestion. It was a command from a partner who saw a thread of fate that Thatcher was still trying to ignore. The weather in Montana was a fickle beast. Within an hour, the crisp morning gave way to a violent and early-season atmospheric shift. Dark, bruised clouds rolled over the peaks and brought a howling wind that shrieked through the valley like a vengeful spirit. Thatcher watched through the rain-streaked windshield as the thorn orchard became a chaotic swirl of gray and green. Elle was out there alone. Her small frame was braced against the gale as she tried to secure a heavy canvas tarp over a stack of freshly harvested crates near the old packing shed. The wind caught the fabric and snapped it like a whip, nearly pulling her off her feet into the mud. Above her, the King's Bough, which was a massive and ancient apple tree that stood as the centerpiece of the orchard, swayed precariously. Thatcher saw the danger before she did. He spotted a jagged crack in one of the primary limbs that had been weakened by years of rot and the sudden, brutal torque of the storm. The limb was the size of a telephone pole, and it was positioned directly above where Elle was kneeling. She was struggling with a stubborn knot and was completely oblivious to the threat. "Coda, out!" Thatcher barked. The command was instinctive and sharp. He did not hesitate because the years of SEAL training took over his mind. This training bypassed his doubt and his fear of confrontation. He hit the door of the Ford Econoline at a dead run. His boots churned up the wet earth as he sprinted down the slippery slope. Coda was a blur of fur at his side. The dog's powerful legs ate up the distance as his instinct for rescue overrode his own aging joints. They reached the orchard fence in seconds, and Thatcher cleared the gate in a single fluid vault. The wind was deafening now, creating a roar that drowned out the sound of the splintering wood above. Elle was focused entirely on the tarp. Her fingers were bloodied from the rough rope, and she was unaware that half a ton of timber was about to descend upon her. "Get down!" Thatcher screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the storm. He launched himself forward. His hand reached out just as the limb gave way with a sound like a gunshot. He tackled Elle with his full weight, slamming into her and driving her into the soft, muddy earth. They hit the ground a split second before the massive branch crashed into the crates. The wood and fruit were pulverized where she had been standing moments before. The impact shook the very ground and sent a spray of splinters and apple mash into the air. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the rain and the heavy, ragged breathing of 3 survivors. Thatcher lay over Elle to shield her with his body while his heart thundered in his chest. Coda stood over them both with his hackles raised. His eyes were fixed on the remaining branches of the tree, and he let out a series of sharp, authoritative barks that seemed to challenge the storm itself. Slowly, Thatcher pushed himself up. His hands were shaking as he wiped the cold mud from his face. He looked down at Elle, who was staring up at him with wide amber eyes filled with a mixture of terror and confusion. She was shivering, and her face was pale, with a small cut on her cheek beginning to bleed. As Thatcher moved to help her up, his jacket collar pulled back. This revealed the twin set of silver dog tags hanging around his neck. Elle's gaze locked onto them, and her breath caught as she recognized the name etched alongside Thatcher's. It read, Liam J. Thorne. The silence that followed was heavier than the fallen tree limb. Thatcher did not say a word. He simply reached out a hand with his scarred palm open, offering her a lifeline he had spent years trying to find the courage to extend. Coda stepped closer and nudged Elle's hand with his wet nose. His presence acted as a bridge between the living and the dead. The storm still raged around them, but in that small circle of mud and broken apples, the war had finally ended. The long and slow work of peace had finally begun. The rain had slowed to a persistent icy drizzle that clung to the eyelashes and soaked through the heaviest canvas. Elowen Thorne remained on the muddy ground, her fingers hovering inches away from the silver dog tags that rested against Thatcher's chest. The name Liam J. Thorne seemed to shimmer under the dull Montana sky, a ghost etched in cold metal. Thatcher felt the heat of her gaze and the sharp, jagged edge of the silence between them. He reached up, his calloused fingers gently tucking the tags back beneath his shirt, closing a door that had been flung wide by the violence of the storm. He stood up slowly, offering his hand again. His movements were deliberate and steady, the practiced grace of a man who had spent a lifetime navigating minefields, both literal and metaphorical. Elle finally took his hand. Her grip was cold and trembling, her skin stained with the juice of crushed apples and the dark earth of her home. As he pulled her to her feet, Thatcher noticed how small she seemed against the backdrop of the devastation. She was a woman holding together a world with nothing but grit and fading memories. And for a second, Thatcher saw the reflected image of his own exhaustion in her amber eyes. "You knew him," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the dripping of the trees. It wasn't a question, but a plea for confirmation. Thatcher didn't answer immediately. He turned to look at the massive limb of the king's bough that now lay like a dead leviathan across the packing crates. The destruction was absolute. Months of Elle's hard labor had been reduced to a pulp of fermented fruit and splinter pine in a single heartbeat. Coda sat beside the fallen branch, his ears pinned back and his tail sweeping the mud in a slow, rhythmic arc. The dog looked at Thatcher, then at Elle, his gaze heavy with the shared history of 3 soldiers. even if one of them was no longer there to claim it. "I was his chief," Thatcher finally said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "He talked about this place every night we were out there. He said the air here tasted like something worth fighting for." I looked away, her jaw tightening as she fought back tears that had been years in the making. She didn't thank him for saving her life. In Whitefish, people didn't thank you for doing what was necessary. They simply expected it of each other. Without waiting for an invitation, Thatcher moved toward the shed. He retrieved a rusted but functional chainsaw he had spotted earlier and began to inspect the fuel line. He worked with a cold mechanical efficiency. He didn't ask for permission to stay, and Al didn't ask him to leave. There was a silent contract signed in the mud between them. He would provide the strength she lacked, and she would provide the reason for him to keep moving. As the saw roared to life, the screaming chain biting into the fallen timber, Thatcher felt the familiar focus of a mission. This was a battlefield he understood. There were no hidden snipers or roadside bombs, only the honest weight of wood and the necessity of order. He cleared the debris, stacking the heavy logs with a precision that bordered on obsessive, while Al began to salvage what remained of the uncrushed fruit. They worked in a tandem of silence for nearly 2 hours, the only sound being the mechanical growl of the saw and the heavy panting of Coda as he dragged smaller branches away from the path. The rhythm of the work was broken when Coda suddenly stopped mid-stride. He dropped a branch he was carrying and trotted toward the old, weathered barn at the edge of the property. The building was a relic of the early 1900s, its crimson paint long since faded to a ghostly pink. Coda didn't bark. He stood at the heavy sliding door and scratched at the wood with a strange, rhythmic insistence. 3 slow strokes, then 2 fast ones. Thatcher froze, the chainsaw idling in his hands. That was the breach code Liam had taught his canine during their second deployment, a playful quirk they had used to signal a hidden cache of supplies. Al stopped her work, watching the dog with a puzzled expression. "He's never done that," she murmured, walking toward the barn. As she pushed the heavy door open, Coda ignored the smell of hay and old oil. He walked straight to a loose floorboard near Liam's old workbench, a place Al hadn't touched in years. He sat on it and let out a single mournful howl that echoed through the rafters. Underneath that board sat a dusty olive-drab ammunition can that Thatcher hadn't expected to see. It wasn't just a coincidence. Coda wasn't just smelling the past. He was pointing to a secret Liam had kept from everyone but his partner. The air in the barn felt thick, charged with an energy that made the hair on Thatcher's neck stand up. It was as if the boundary between the living and the dead had worn thin, and Coda was the only one capable of seeing the bridge. The moment of quiet revelation was shattered by the sound of a vehicle approaching. A white Ford Expedition with the Flathead County Sheriff's decal on the door crunched up the gravel driveway, its tires spitting wet stones. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out who seemed to occupy more space than the law allowed. This was Sheriff Miller. He was in his late 40s, a burly man with a barrel chest and shoulders that stretched the seams of his tan uniform. His face was weathered and ruddy, a map of outdoor life and high blood pressure. He wore a thick horseshoe mustache that was almost entirely white, contrasting sharply with his tanned skin. Miller walked with a heavy, authoritative roll, his belt jingling with the weight of his radio, handcuffs, and a Glock 17. His eyes were a pale, watery gray, the kind of eyes that had seen every lie a small town could tell and had long since stopped caring about the truth. Miller was a man who valued order over justice, and his presence usually meant a ledger was being balanced somewhere. "Afternoon, Al," Miller said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that carried a false sense of neighborly concern. He didn't look at her. He looked at the fallen tree and then at Thatcher, his gaze lingering on the scars and the military posture. "Heard the King's Bow finally gave up the ghost. That's a hell of a mess." He tipped his hat toward Thatcher, but his eyes remained cold. "Don't recognize the help. You from out of town, son?" Thatcher didn't answer. He stood his ground, the chainsaw held at his side, his thumb resting near the kill switch. He recognized the type of man Miller was, a local kingpin who used the badge as a shield for his own interests. Miller didn't wait for a response. He turned his attention back to Elle, pulling a folded yellow document from his pocket. The county inspector saw the drone footage of the collapse. They're marking the packing shed and the barn as unsafe for occupancy due to structural instability. Since you're already 90 days delinquent on the property taxes and the safety fines, the office is moving up the auction date. You've got 48 hours to vacate the primary structures, Elle. I'm sorry, truly, but a liability is a liability. The sheriff's tone was as flat as the Montana plains. He wasn't there to help. He was there to facilitate the end of the Thorne legacy. He looked at Thatcher again, a subtle warning in his posture. "And I'd be careful who you let stay on the property. Vagrancy laws are being enforced strictly these days." Elle stood paralyzed, the yellow paper in her hand looking like a death warrant. The weight of the world seemed to finally break her, her shoulders slumping as she stared at the mud. But Thatcher didn't move. He looked at Coda, who had emerged from the barn and was now standing between Elle and the sheriff. The dog didn't growl. He simply stared at Miller with a terrifying, unblinking intensity, his lips pulled back just enough to show the ivory of his canines. It was the look of a predator that had identified a target. Thatcher felt a cold, familiar fire igniting in his gut. He had spent years destroying things in the name of a flag, and he was tired of watching good people lose everything to men like Miller. "The logs are cleared, Elle," Thatcher said, his voice cutting through Miller's authority like a knife. He ignored the sheriff entirely. "I'll start on the barn roof tomorrow morning. We've got 48 hours. That's more than enough time to stabilize a structure if you know what you're doing." Miller's face flushed a deeper shade of red, his hand instinctively resting on his belt. "I wouldn't advise interfering with a county order, Mr. Vance." Thatcher finally looked him in the eye, a cold, flinty stare that had made stronger men than Miller flinch. "I'm not interfering, Sheriff. I'm just fixing a roof. Unless there's a law against a man helping a friend, I suggest you get back in your truck before the mud gets any deeper." The standoff lasted a heartbeat too long before Miller scoffed, adjusting his hat and turning back to his vehicle. As the expedition roared away, leaving a cloud of exhaust in the damp air, Thatcher turned to Elle. She was looking at the ammo Coda had found, her eyes searching Thatcher's face for an answer he wasn't yet ready to give. The war wasn't over. It had just moved to a different valley, and this time, Thatcher wasn't leaving anyone behind. The first light of the Montana morning was a pale, filtered gold that struggled to penetrate the thick canopy of the Thorne orchard. Inside the barn, the air remained trapped in a layer of chill, smelling of old motor oil, fermented cider, and the heavy silence of secrets. Thatcher Vance knelt on the dirt floor, his large, scarred hands resting on the lid of the olive drab ammunition Coda had uncovered. The metal was cool to the touch, pitted with age but still sealed tight. Beside him, Elaine stood with her arms wrapped tightly around her chest, her wheat-colored hair messy, and her amber eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and profound dread. Coda sat like a sentinel, his silvered muzzle pointing toward the box, his tail giving an occasional soft thump against the floorboards. With a sharp, metallic groan, Thatcher pried the latch open. He expected to find letters, or perhaps a cache of emergency cash, but the contents were far more deliberate. Inside lay a stack of waterproof field notebooks, a set of high-detail topographic maps of the Flathead Valley, and a small, leather-bound pouch. As Thatcher pulled out the maps, he noticed they weren't standard issue. They were covered in Liam's neat technical handwriting, with specific coordinates circled in red ink not on the Thorne property, but on the public lands surrounding it. Thatcher's SEAL training immediately began to overlay the data. These weren't farming notes. These were survey marks. Before he could delve deeper, the sound of a rattling engine echoed through the yard. A battered, mud-splattered 1985 Jeep CJ7 pulled up, its brakes squealing as it halted. Out stepped a man who looked like he had been fashioned from the very timber of the mountains. This was Doc Holloway, the local veterinarian and a man who had forgotten more about whitefish than the town's records would ever hold. Doc was in his late 60s, tall and spindly, with shoulders that sloped forward as if he were perpetually leaning into a headwind. His hair was a wild, snowy mane tucked under a stained Montana stick cap, and a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles sat precariously on the bridge of a hawk-like nose. He wore a faded flannel shirt and a canvas vest filled with thermometers, syringes, and various bits of twine. Doc was a man of few words but immense presence. His eyes, a sharp and knowing emerald green, moved with the precision of a surgeon's. He had served as a combat medic in the Gulf War before returning home to heal animals, and he carried that dual identity in the way he moved, part healer, part warrior. "Heard the king's bow came down," Doc said, his voice a dry, gravelly rasp that managed to sound both weary and kind. He walked straight to Coda, ignoring Thatcher and Elle at first, his hands reaching out to check the dog's joints with an expert touch. "And I heard the sheriff was sniffing around." Miller's always been a buzzard for a fresh carcass. He looked up at Thatcher, his gaze lingering on the scars and the tactical stillness. "You must be Vance. Liam talked about you. Said you were the only man he knew who could find a needle in a hay baler while it was running." Doc finally turned to Elle, his expression softening. "I'm here to check the old boy's paw, Elle, and maybe to tell you that the auction notice Miller gave you is as crooked as a dog's hind leg." Thatcher reached back into the ammo can to pull out the leather pouch, but Coda suddenly lunged forward. It wasn't an attack, but a frantic, deliberate movement to pin Thatcher's hand against the metal lid. The dog's amber eyes were wide, and he let out a low, vibrating hum, a sound Thatcher had only heard once before, during a night op in the mountains of Afghanistan when they were inches away from an undetonated IED. Thatcher froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't pull away. He watched as Coda gently nudged the leather pouch out of Thatcher's fingers and toward Ilawan. As Elle took the pouch, her fingers trembling, she pulled out a single tarnished silver compass. On the back, an inscription was etched into the metal: "To find the way home when the stars are hidden." But it wasn't the words that stopped the room's breath. It was the fact that the needle wasn't pointing north. It was spinning erratically, then snapping with violent force toward the king's bough, the massive fallen tree outside. Coda turned his head toward the window, his hackles rising as a strange, high-pitched frequency, audible only to the dog and perhaps the ghost of the man who owned the box, seemed to ripple through the barn. Thatcher looked at Doc Holloway, whose emerald eyes were wide with a sudden, terrifying realization. "The compass isn't broken," Doc whispered, his voice trembling. "It's reacting to a magnetic pull. Liam didn't mark those maps because of the orchard, Elle. He marked them because of what's under it." The weight of Doc's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Thatcher took the compass, feeling a strange, thrumming vibration through the metal. His mind raced. If the land held significant magnetic anomalies, it could indicate rare earth minerals or something far more valuable than timber and apples. This explained why a major mining corporation was using Sheriff Miller to harass a lone woman off her property. It wasn't about a failed orchard. It was about the ground beneath it. "We don't have time for a geological survey," Thatcher said, his voice regaining its hard, military edge. "We have 47 hours left before Miller comes back with a tow truck and a lockbolt. If he thinks this barn is structurally unsound, we prove him wrong." Doc Holloway nodded, his weary face hardening into a mask of grim determination. "I've got some jacks and some heavy timber in the back of the Jeep. I was supposed to fix a fence over at the Miller Ranch, but I think I've developed a sudden case of forgetfulness." He looked at Thatcher. "You know how to set a structural brace." Thatcher grunted, already moving toward the back of the barn to find a sledgehammer. "I've built bridges under mortar fire, Doc. A barn roof in Montana is a vacation." The rest of the day became a blur of rhythmic grinding labor. Thatcher worked with a ferocious intensity that surprised even himself. He climbed into the rafters, his boots gripping the aged timber as he hammered heavy steel plates into the weak points of the roof. Below him, El and Doc worked as his ground crew, hauling lumber and clearing away decades of debris. Coda remained on high alert, his position shifting every hour to cover the perimeter. The dog's intuition was uncanny. He would growl minutes before a gust of wind threatened to shift the leaning barn, giving Thatcher time to brace himself. By late afternoon, the smell of sawdust and sweat had replaced the scent of decay. The barn, while still old and weathered, felt solid, anchored by the sheer force of Thatcher's will and Doc's expertise. As the sun began to dip behind the Flathead Range, painting the sky in violent streaks of purple and orange, Thatcher sat on the tailgate of Doc's Jeep, his shirt soaked and his muscles screaming. Elle brought him a tin mug of water, sitting down beside him. She looked at the King's Bow, then at the barn, and finally at Thatcher. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "My brother is gone. You don't owe us your life." Thatcher looked at Coda, who was currently lying at the base of the fallen tree, his head resting on the very spot where the magnetic compass had pointed. "I'm not doing it for Liam," Thatcher said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm doing it because the world is full of men like Miller who think they can take whatever they want just because they have a badge or a bank account. And because Coda hasn't slept this well in years. He knows we're exactly where we're supposed to be." Elle reached out, her hand grazing Thatcher's arm, a fleeting moment of human warmth in the cold Montana twilight. But the peace was short-lived. In the distance, at the very edge of the property line, Thatcher saw the glint of sunlight off a pair of binoculars. Miller's subcontractors were watching. The 48-hour clock was ticking and the real fight hadn't even begun. The Montana night settled over the thorn orchard like a heavy indigo velvet shroud, bringing with it a silence so profound it felt predatory. Thatcher Vance did not sleep. He sat on the porch of the farmhouse, his back against the weathered siding, a mug of cold coffee resting between his boots. The darkness was an old friend to a man like Thatcher. It was the element where he felt most at home, stripped of the distractions of the day. Around his neck, the silver dog tags remained a constant rhythmic weight against his skin. He had spent the last 3 hours setting up a rudimentary but effective perimeter. Using thin fishing line and small clusters of empty cider cans he had scavenged from the shed, he created a series of trip flares along the orchard's southern boundary, the area where the binoculars had glinted earlier. He wasn't just protecting a piece of land. He was defending a breach. At the edge of the property, silhouetted against the rising moon, stood a man who watched with the patience of a vulture. This was Silas Vane, the project coordinator for North Shore Property Services, though his title was merely a corporate mask for a professional predator. Silas was in his early 50s, a man of terrifyingly precise proportions. He was tall and exceptionally lean, with a frame that looked as though it were made of piano wire and cold calculation. His hair was a stark, unnaturally uniform silver, slicked back from a high, aristocratic forehead. His face was a mask of pale, unlined skin, save for the deep vertical creases around a mouth that rarely smiled. Silas wore a charcoal designer raincoat that looked out of place in the Montana mud, and his eyes were a flat, lifeless obsidian, the kind of eyes that saw people as obstacles to be moved or resources to be exploited. He was a man who didn't use bow luck if he could use a contract, but he had no qualms about using both if the deadline demanded it. Inside the barn, Doc Holloway had set up a makeshift camp, His old Jeep parked inside the reinforced structure as a secondary barricade. Al had finally succumbed to exhaustion, sleeping on a cot near Liam's old workbench, her hand still resting on the olive drab ammo can as if it were a holy relic. Thatcher watched the tree line, his flint blue eyes moving in a slow, rhythmic scan. Coda was not on the porch with him. The dog was down by the king's bow, the massive fallen limb casting a long, twisted shadow across the mud. Coda's behavior had become increasingly erratic since they had opened the box. He wasn't guarding the house. He was obsessed with the roots of the fallen tree. The dog would circle the stump, his nose pressed deep into the disturbed earth, letting out a series of soft, inquisitive whines that Thatcher had never heard before. It was as if the dog was listening to a conversation happening deep beneath the soil, a frequency that bypassed human ears, but resonated in the very marrow of the animal's bones. Around midnight, the air grew unnaturally still, the wind dying down to a ghostly whisper. Thatcher watched as Coda stopped his circling and began to dig with a frantic, purposeful intensity. He wasn't digging like a dog looking for a bone. He was excavating. Thatcher stood up, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt, and moved silently toward the tree. As he approached, Coda stopped and looked up. In the moonlight, the dog's amber eyes didn't look like an animal's. They held a piercing human clarity that made Thatcher's heart skip a beat. Coda reached into the hole he had dug and pulled out a small mud-caked object, trotting over to drop it at Thatcher's feet. It was a Zippo lighter, the brass casing tarnished but unmistakable. Thatcher picked it up, wiping away the grime to reveal an engraving of a trident and a set of coordinates that matched the red circles on Liam's map. But that wasn't the shock. When Thatcher flicked the lighter, it didn't spark. Instead, the metal casing began to vibrate with a high-pitched hum, and the flame, when it finally caught, burned with a brilliant, unnatural emerald green hue. For 3 seconds, the green light illuminated the orchard, and in that glow, Thatcher didn't see the orchard as it was. He saw a shimmering grid of light beneath the earth, a network of veins that pulsed like a living heart. Coda leaned his head against Thatcher's leg, and for a fleeting second, Thatcher felt a surge of calm that wasn't his own. It was Liam's calm. It was the feeling of a mission finally reaching its terminal phase. "You knew it was here, didn't you, buddy?" Thatcher whispered. Coda licked his hand, the emerald flame reflecting in his eyes like a promise from the afterlife. The morning arrived with the subtle, threatening hum of an engine. By 7 a.m., the white expedition of Sheriff Miller returned, but this time it was followed by a black luxury SUV with tinted windows. Silas Vane stepped out of the black vehicle, his polished leather shoes clicking on the gravel as if the mud were beneath his notice. Miller looked uncomfortable, his face a shade of mottled purple, standing half a step behind the silver-haired man. Thatcher stood at the gate, Coda at his side, the dog's hackles rising in a jagged line along his spine. Elle and Doc Holloway emerged from the barn, Elle's face hardened by the revelations of the previous night. She held the silver compass in her hand, the needle still twitching toward the king's bow. "Mr. Vance," Silas said, his voice a smooth, refrigerated tenor that carried no warmth. He didn't offer a hand. He simply looked at Thatcher as one might inspect a piece of malfunctioning machinery. "I've reviewed your file. Senior Chief Vance, a distinguished career in the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. It's a pity to see such a tactical mind wasted on a dying orchard." Silas tilted his head, his obsidian eye scanning the reinforced barn roof. "The structural repairs you've made are impressive, but they are irrelevant. The county has issued a secondary order for environmental testing. We believe the collapse of the King's Bow has released toxins into the local water table. This property is being condemned for public safety, effective immediately." Miller stepped forward, his hand resting nervously on his holster. "Look, Al, I told you. This is out of my hands now. You and your friend Need to pack up and go. Mr. Vane here is offering a generous relocation stipend if you sign the transfer today. It's more than this dirt is worth. Elle didn't flinch. She stepped up beside Thatcher, her wheat-colored hair blowing in the cold breeze. The dirt isn't for sale, Miller. And we know why you want it. My brother didn't die for you to steal his home because of a magnetic anomaly. We know what's under the orchard. Silas Vane's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed, the obsidian darkening. He looked at the Zippo lighter tucked into Thatcher's tactical vest, then at Coda. A small cold smirk touched the corners of his mouth. Knowledge is a dangerous thing for those without the power to protect it, Miss Thorne. He turned to Thatcher, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a blade. I know about the mission in the Hindu Kush, Chief. I know who really triggered that pressure plate. Do you think Elle would still want you here if she knew the truth? Sign the papers, or the next storm won't be a work of nature. Silas turned and walked back to his SUV without waiting for an answer. Miller hesitated, looking between Thatcher and the departing corporate predator before scuttling back to his own vehicle. As the dust settled, Thatcher felt the weight of Silas's threat. The clock hadn't just accelerated. It had been rigged to explode. Thatcher looked at Elle, the guilt he had carried for years suddenly feeling like a physical wound, while Coda stared at the departing cars, his growl a low tectonic warning of the violence to come. The silence that followed the departure of Silas Vane's black SUV was more corrosive than the storm that had toppled the King's Bow. Thatcher Vance stood as still as a statue, his flint blue eyes fixed on the dust settling in the driveway, while the weight of Silas's final words pressed against his lungs. I know who really triggered that pressure plate. It was a poison-tipped arrow aimed at the very foundation of the fragile trust he had built with Alawan. Beside him, Coda remained in a low crouch, his charcoal fur standing in a jagged ridge along his spine, his amber eyes darting toward Thatcher as if sensing the sudden, violent turbulence in his master's soul. Alawan Thorne stood frozen, the yellow condemnation notice fluttering in her hand like the wing of a dying bird. She looked at Thatcher, her amber eyes searching his hard, scarred face for a denial that didn't come fast enough. The wheat-colored hair that had been messy from labor now seemed to frame a face that was suddenly ancient with suspicion. Thatcher felt the impulse to speak, to explain the chaotic geometry of a blast zone where truth was often pulverized into red dust, but his throat was a desert of unuttered grief. Before the tension could shatter, Doc Holloway stepped between them, his snowy mane of hair windswept and his emerald eyes flashing with a medic's urgency. Inside. Now, Doc commanded, his gravelly voice leaving no room for debate. He led them back into the reinforced barn, the smell of sawdust and sweat providing a grounding contrast to the corporate malice outside. As they retreated into the shadows of the timber beams, a new figure emerged from the back of Doc's Jeep, someone who had been crouching low in the footwell. This was Sarah Sal Jenkins, a woman who looked like she had been carved from the same hard luck as Thatcher. Sal was in her late 30s, possessing a lean, wiry frame that suggested a lifetime of dodging shadows. Her hair was a shock of short, electric copper curls, and her skin was a pale, freckled canvas marked by a thin, silvery scar that ran from the corner of her mouth to her jawline, remnant of a data breach operation gone wrong in a past life. She was a former Signals intelligence analyst who had disappeared into the Montana woods to escape the reach of agencies that no longer valued her ethics. Sal was sharp, cynical, and moved with a twitchy, nervous energy, her hands perpetually hovering over the ruggedized laptop strapped to her chest like a shield. She didn't look at people. She looked through them, as if searching for the source code of their intentions. Silas Vane doesn't bluff, Sal said, her voice a rapid-fire staccato as she opened her laptop on Liam's old workbench. I've been monitoring the North Shore property encryption. They aren't waiting for the 48 hours. Vane has hired a recovery team to move in tonight under the cover of the environmental testing order. Their lead by a man named Mick Sullivan. She pulled up a grainy photo of a man who looked like a nightmare dressed in tactical nylon. Mick the Hatchet Sullivan was a brute of a man, an ex-Army Ranger who had been dishonorably discharged for excessive violence. He was built like a brick oven, with a thick, bull-like neck and a head shaven completely bald, save for a jagged tattoo of a hatchet on the back of his cranium. His face was a landscape of broken capillaries and scar tissue, with a flat, crooked nose and a missing ring finger on his left hand. Sullivan was a man who enjoyed the kinetic part of the job, a blunt instrument Silas used when contracts failed. Thatcher didn't focus on the photo of Sullivan. His attention was pulled toward Coda, who had walked over to the olive-drab ammo can and began to nudge the green-flamed Zippo lighter with his nose. The dog let out a sharp, inquisitive yip, then looked directly at the topographic maps Liam had left behind. Thatcher felt a strange magnetic pull in his chest, a sensation of static electricity that made his skin crawl. He picked up the Zippo and flicked it open. The emerald flame hissed to life, burning with that unnatural, brilliant intensity. As the green light washed over the maps, Thatcher's breath caught. The red circles Liam had drawn didn't just mark coordinates. Under the specific frequency of the green light, hidden ink began to emerge in visible lines of text written in a chemical agent that only reacted to the anomaly. Thatcher leaned in, his heart hammering as he read the words written in Liam's hand. "Thatcher, if you're seeing this, you found the key. It wasn't your fault. I saw the wire. I chose the step so you could finish the map. The bow is the anchor. Don't let them dig it up. The pulse belongs to the world, not the boardrooms." Alaun leaned in beside him, her shoulder brushing his, and as she read her brother's final absolution, she let out a sob that broke the dam of her suspicion. Coda placed his heavy head on her thigh, his tail giving a single authoritative thud. The dog wasn't just a guardian. He was the carrier of a dead man's peace, a bridge that had finally allowed the truth to cross back into the light. The revelation of Liam's message transformed the atmosphere from one of desperate defense to a calculated counteroffensive. Thatcher felt the weight of 10 years of guilt lift from his shoulders, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus that he hadn't felt since his time in the teams. "They're coming for the anchor," Thatcher said, his voice a low, predatory growl that made Sullivan's photo look insignificant. "Sullivan and his team will come from the South Ridge. They'll try to disable the generator first to kill the lights." He looked at Sal, who was already tapping away at her keyboard. "Can you jam their coms?" Sal gave a grim, lopsided smile, the scar on her jaw twitching. "I can make their radios play nothing but static and 1940s polka music, Chief. I can also loop the drone feeds Silas is watching so he sees a peaceful orchard while we're taking out the trash." Thatcher turned to Doc and Elle. "Stay in the barn. Brace the doors. If anyone gets past me, Coda will be your last line." He looked at the German shepherd. Coda's ears were forward, his body coiled like a high-tension spring. The dog knew. He had transitioned from the gentle companion of the afternoon to the apex predator of the night. Thatcher didn't need to give a command. He and Coda moved into the darkness of the orchard, disappearing into the rows of apple trees as the moon was swallowed by a fresh bank of clouds. The first contact happened near the southern fence line. Thatcher heard them before he saw them, the heavy, arrogant footfalls of men who didn't respect the terrain. There were 4 of them, moving in a loose wedge formation, their night vision goggles glowing like the eyes of technological insects. Mick Sullivan was in the lead, carrying a suppressed submachine gun as if it were an extension of his own ego. Thatcher watched from the shadows of a Macintosh tree, his breathing slow and shallow. Coda was 20 yards to his left, a shadow among shadows, waiting for the signal. Thatcher didn't use a gun. He used the orchard. He pulled a thin cord, releasing one of his homemade trip flares a cluster of cider cans filled with magnesium shavings. The explosion of white light was blinding, shattering the darkness and overloading the sensors of the intruder's night vision goggles. In the chaos, Thatcher moved like a phantom. He struck the first man with a palm strike to the throat, disappearing back into the trees before the second man could turn. To the left, Coda was a blur of teeth and fur. The dog didn't bark. He launched himself at the second intruder, his 90-pound frame hitting the man's chest with the force of a battering ram. The man went down with a scream, his weapon clattering into the mud as Coda pinned his arm, his growl a terrifying, tectonic vibration that vibrated through the man's bones. Thatcher moved toward Sullivan, who was frantically rubbing his eyes and swinging his weapon blindly. "Sullivan!" Thatcher's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. The big man froze, his bald head glistening with sweat in the fading light of the flare. Silas Vane sent a boy to do a man's job. "You've got 30 seconds to get your team off this property, or I'll let the dog decide how this ends." Sullivan tried to level his weapon, but Thatcher was already behind him, the edge of a combat knife pressing cold against Sullivan's jugular. The standoff lasted only seconds before Sullivan felt the predatory heat of Coda's breath against his ankle. The brute realized he wasn't fighting a farmer. He was fighting the ghosts of a war he had never been man enough to win. "Fine," Sullivan spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "We're leaving, but Vane won't stop. He'll burn this whole valley down to get what's under that tree." Thatcher didn't blink. He watched as the four men retreated toward their vehicles, their recovery mission, a humiliated wreck. As the sound of their engines faded into the distance, Thatcher stood under the King's bow, the green flame Zippo still warm in his pocket. Coda walked over and sat at his side, looking up at the moon as the clouds parted. The first wave was over, but Thatcher knew Silas Vane was the kind of man who would rather destroy a treasure than let anyone else hold it. He looked toward the farmhouse where Elle was waiting, knowing that the secret beneath the orchard was now a beacon for a much larger storm. The aftermath of the skirmish left a metallic tang in the air, a mixture of ozone from Sal's jamming equipment and the sharp, acidic scent of the trip flares. Thatcher Vance retreated into the shadows of the reinforced barn, his movements fluid but heavy with the adrenaline come down. Coda followed at his heel, the dog's breathing rhythmic and deep, his charcoal fur still matted with the mud of the orchard. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of tension. They had won a battle, but the war was shifting from a legal skirmish into something far more ancient and dangerous. Sal Jenkins was hunched over her laptop, blue light reflecting off her copper curls and the silvery scar on her jaw. She was tapping frantically, her eyes wide as she monitored the fallout of her digital sabotage. "Sullivan and his team are dark," she whispered, not looking up. "But Vane is rerouting. He's calling in a legal emergency stay from a judge in Helena. They're going to claim the orchard as a site of a domestic terror threat now. Thanks to your flares, Thatcher." He's flipping the script. Thatcher didn't respond immediately. He was watching Ilawan. She sat on the workbench, her fingers tracing the maps Liam had left behind. The absolution in her brother's hidden message had cleared the suspicion from her eyes, but it had been replaced by a quiet, burning resolve. Before the group could formulate a plan, Coda's head snapped toward the open barn door. He didn't growl. Instead, he stood and let out a soft, welcoming huff. A figure stepped out of the swirling mist of the orchard, moving with a silence that rivaled Thatcher's own. This was Caleb Ironcloud, an elder from the nearby Salish community, and a man whose family had lived in the shadow of the Flathead Range for generations. Caleb was in his mid-70s, standing tall and straight like an old-growth cedar. His skin was the color of burnished mahogany, deeply lined by the sun and the wisdom of decades. He wore an old, faded denim jacket adorned with intricate beadwork and a pair of worn leather boots that made no sound on the dirt floor. His hair was a stunning snowy white, braided neatly down his back, and his eyes were a deep, piercing obsidian that seemed to hold the reflection of 1,000 campfires. Caleb was a historian of the unwritten, a man who understood that the land had a memory far longer than any deed or contract. He had known Liam's father, and he had been watching the thorn orchard from the periphery for a long time. Caleb carried an air of profound, unshakable peace, but there was a sharp edge to his gaze that suggested he was not a man to be trifled with. "The pulse is getting louder," Caleb said, his voice a rich, resonant chime that seemed to vibrate in the very timber of the barn. He looked at Thatcher, then at Coda. "The dog knows. He's been hearing the song of the mountains since the king's bow fell." Thatcher stepped forward, his flint blue eyes narrowing. "You know what's under this dirt, Caleb?" The elder nodded, walking toward the olive-drab ammo can. "My ancestors called it the Heartstone. To your scientists, it is a massive rare earth singularity, a magnetic anomaly that stabilizes the water table and the soil for 50 miles. To men like Silas Vane, it is merely $1 billion in a boardroom. But Liam knew. He spent his leaves out here with me, mapping the veins. He knew that if Vane digs it up, the valley dies. The water will turn to salt, and the trees will wither in a single season. The Golden Bough was never just a tree, Chief. It was a biological anchor. Its roots were fed by the frequency of that stone." Elawan stood up, the silver compass in her hand. "That's why the needle spins. It's not just a mineral. It's a circuit." Caleb gestured for them to follow him out to the fallen king's bow. The moon had emerged from the clouds, casting a ghostly silver light over the pulverized apples and broken wood. Caleb knelt by the deep hole Coda had excavated earlier and asked Thatcher to open the green-flamed Zippo. As the emerald light hissed to life, Caleb began to hum a low, guttural chant that matched the high-pitched vibration of the lighter. Suddenly, Coda did something Thatcher had never seen. The dog sat at the edge of the hole, tilted his head back, and began to sing. It wasn't a howl or a bark. It was a perfect harmonic pitch that resonated with the humming of the earth. As the dog's voice joined the elder's chant, the ground beneath them began to glow with a faint pulsing bioluminescence. The veins of light Thatcher had seen earlier through the Zippo's flame became visible to everyone, a shimmering, emerald web that stretched out from the roots of the fallen tree like a nervous system. In the center of the pulse, the air began to shimmer, and for a heartbeat, a translucent silhouette stood among them. It was a man in desert fatigues, his hand resting on Coda's phantom head. Elawan let out a choked sob as the figure turned, his face a perfect, peaceful image of Liam. He didn't speak, but his eyes met Thatcher's, and in that gaze, Thatcher felt a data dump of pure tactical intuition. The ghost pointed not at the house, but at a specific ridge to the north, where a series of red lights were beginning to flicker in the distance. The vision vanished as Coda stopped his song, leaving the orchard in sudden, heavy darkness. "He's not just a memory anymore," Caleb whispered, his obsidian eyes wet with light. "The anchor has chosen its new guardians, and Silas Vane is bringing the heavy iron." The tactical implications of the vision were immediate. The red lights on the north ridge weren't scouts. They were the markers for industrial drilling rigs and armored transport. Silas Vane had decided to bypass the legalities entirely, moving his primary extraction equipment under the cover of an emergency stay he had fabricated. Sal Jenkins scrambled back to the barn, her fingers flying across the keys. "He's right. I'm picking up heavy satellite activity. Vane has authorized a full recovery protocol. He's not just coming for the land. He's coming to excavate the singularity tonight. He knows the feds will be here by morning to investigate our terror threat, so he has to have the stone out and in a lead-line container before the sun comes up." Thatcher felt the old, cold clarity of a mission briefing. The ridge the Phantom Liam had pointed to was the only access road wide enough for the heavy machinery. It was a choke point, a narrow, winding trail with a 200-foot drop on one side and a sheer rock face on the other. "Doc, take Al and Sal to Caleb's cabin," Thatcher commanded, his voice returning to the iron tone of a senior chief. "It's off the grid and protected by the tribal boundary. Vane won't touch it." Elle stepped toward him, her face set in a hard line. "No, I'm not running again, Thatcher. This is my brother's legacy. It's my home." Thatcher looked at her, seeing the same stubborn fire that had made Liam the best point man in the Navy. He nodded once, a gesture of respect. "Then you stay in the barn with Sal. We need that Comes-loop running. If Vane can't talk to his rigs, he can't coordinate the dig." He turned to Caleb. "Can you lead me through the high trail to that ridge?" Caleb smiled, a slow, knowing expression. "I was walking those trails before you were born, soldier. I will show you where the earth is softest." Thatcher checked his gear. He had his combat knife, the green-flamed Zippo, and a heavy-duty winch cable he'd taken from the shed. He looked at Coda. The dog was standing by the barn door, his tail held high, his amber eyes locked on the north ridge. There was no fear in the animal, only a predatory readiness that mirrored Thatcher's own. They were no longer just a man and his dog. They were a singular weapon system, tuned to the frequency of the valley they were born to protect. As they moved out into the cold Montana night, Thatcher felt the pulse of the Heartstone to the soles of his boots. It felt like a countdown. Silas Vane was coming with the full weight of corporate greed, backed by men who didn't believe in ghosts or the song of the earth. But as Thatcher and Coda disappeared into the pines, following Caleb Ironclad toward the final confrontation, Thatcher knew one thing for certain. Silas Vane had never fought a war where the terrain itself was an enemy. The war for Thorn Orchard was moving into the deep, and in the darkness of the North Ridge, the ghosts were waiting to be heard. The ascent to the North Ridge was a brutal test of lung and limb, a vertical odyssey through a labyrinth of ancient pines and jagged limestone. Thatcher Vance moved with a rhythmic, predatory grace that defied his 40 years. He was a man synchronized with the shadows, his breathing shallow and controlled to match the thin mountain air. Beside him, Coda moved like a charcoal ghost. The German shepherd's joints ached from the cold and the cumulative miles of a lifetime of service, but his amber eyes burned with a terrifying singular purpose. He did not falter because he knew this was the final objective of the mission he and Thatcher had, started in a desert thousands of miles away. Behind them, Caleb Ironclad moved with the silent, effortless ease of the terrain itself, his snowy braids swinging against his denim jacket. As they reached the summit of the ridge, the sheer scale of Silas Vane's desperation became visible. Below them, on the narrow access road that Liam had mapped with such fatal precision, a convoy of industrial nightmares was lumbering forward. Two massive, articulated drilling rigs, their steel frames glowing under high-intensity floodlights, were being escorted by a line of black, armored SUVs. The hum of the engines was a low, tectonic vibration that seemed to clash with the natural frequency of the Heartstone pulsing beneath their feet. Leading the convoy was a man Thatcher had not seen before, standing through the sunroof of the lead vehicle with a thermal scanner in his hand. This was Gunnarsson, a former Swedish mountain commando turned freelance security specialist. Gunnarsson was a mountain of a man in his late 30s, possessing a chest like a beer keg and arms corded with heavy, functional muscle. His hair was a shock of pale, icy blonde cropped close to his skull, and a thick, well-groomed beard of the same color covered a face that looked as though it had been chiseled from a frozen block of marble. He was a man of cold, surgical violence, his eyes a pale, unnerving shade of Arctic blue that showed no empathy. He wore a high-tech white camouflage parka and moved with a terrifyingly efficient economy of motion. Unlike Mick Sullivan, Gunnarsson was a professional who respected the environment only so he could better exploit its weaknesses. He was the man Silas Vane called when the terrain itself became a combatant. Thatcher looked at Coda and gave a single, flat-handed signal. "Stay low." Thatcher moved to the edge of the overlook, unspooling the heavy-duty winch cable he had taken from the shed. His plan was a masterpiece of tactical simplicity. The road below was a narrow shelf, and the lead rig was currently crossing a section where the granite had been undercut by centuries of erosion. If he could disable the lead vehicle and trigger a localized rockfall, the entire convoy would be trapped, giving Sal Jenkins enough time to broadcast the illegal activity to the federal authorities who were already inbound. Thatcher began to hammer the anchor bolts into the rock face, the sound of the steel on stone swallowed by the roar of the machinery below. He worked with a feverish intensity, his hands steady despite the biting cold. The rhythm of his work was shattered by Coda. The dog did not growl or bark. Instead, he walked to the very edge of the precipice and began to vibrate. It was a physical manifestation of the magnetic pulse, the silver fur on his snout standing straight up as if charged by static electricity. Coda turned to Thatcher and let out a soft, keening moan, his amber eyes reflecting the emerald-green glow of the hard stones, frequency that was now erupting from the earth in visible waves. Thatcher looked at the Zippo lighter in his pocket. It was vibrating so violently it felt like it would explode. Suddenly, Coda stepped off the ledge. Thatcher's heart stopped as the dog descended into the mist, but he didn't fall. A shimmering bridge of emerald light, formed by the sheer intensity of the magnetic singularity reacting to the dog's DNA, held Coda aloft. In that moment, Thatcher realized that Coda wasn't just a dog. He was the key to the circuit. Through the glowing mist, the phantom of Liam appeared once more, not as a memory, but as a tactical overlay. Liam's hand pointed toward a specific fault line in the road that Gunnarsson's sensors had missed. The ghost's eyes met Thatcher's, and a profound, wordless peace washed over the X-seal. "The dog isn't yours, Thatcher." Liam's voice echoed in his mind, resonant and clear. "He's the mountain's. Let him lead." Coda turned back to Thatcher and barked a sound that carried the frequency of the hard stone itself. The sound hit the rock face with the force of a sonic boom, and the fault line Liam had pointed to began to spiderweb with terrifying speed. The reaction was instantaneous. The ground beneath Gunnarsson's lead rig groaned and then vanished. The massive machine tilted, its steel tread screeching against the rock as it slid into the abyss. Gunnarsson leaped from his vehicle with predatory speed, his arctic blue eyes widening as he saw Thatcher and the glowing dog on the ridge above. He pulled a high-powered rifle and aimed, but the magnetic pulse from the Heartstone was so intense that the electronics in his scope fried in a shower of sparks. Thatcher didn't wait. He rappelled down the cable, hitting the road with a heavy thud, his combat knife drawn. The final confrontation was a blur of mud, steel, and cold determination. Gunnarsson attacked with the fury of a cornered beast, but Thatcher fought with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a man who had finally found his home. He used the big man's momentum against him, dodging a massive fist and delivering a precise strike to Gunnarsson's knee. As the mercenary fell, Coda launched himself from the Emerald Bridge, landing on Gunnarsson's chest and pinning him with a growl that sounded like a rock slide. "It's over," Thatcher said, his voice a cold rasp. "The feds are 10 minutes out, and your boss is going to jail for a very long time." Just then, a helicopter crested the ridge, its searchlight bathing the scene in blinding white. From the side of the bird, a woman in a dark field jacket descended via hoist. This was Agent Regina Cross of the Department of the Interior. She was in her mid-40s, sharp-featured with dark hair pulled back into a tight, professional bun. Her eyes were dark and no-nonsense, her skin tan from years of field investigations. She was the one Sal Jenkins had contacted through the tribal channels. Regina stepped onto the road, looking at the wreckage of the rig, then at Thatcher, and the massive, glowing German Shepherd. "Senior Chief Vance," she said, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "I suggest you and your dog step back. We'll take it from here." Silas Vane was arrested at the airport 10 minutes ago. The war for Thorn Orchard ended not with a bang, but with the quiet return of the natural order. By spring, the Montana Valley was a sea of brilliant green and gold. The golden bough was no longer a fallen limb. Through the mysterious energy of the heartstone and Thatcher's meticulous care, a new sapling had sprouted from the center of the old stump. It grew with an impossible vitality, its leaves shimmering with a faint, healthy gold. Thatcher Vance sat on the porch of the farmhouse, no longer a ghost in a van, but a man who had finally unpacked his bags. His black Ford Econoline was gone, replaced by a working tractor and a sense of belonging. Elowens stood beside him, her hair wheat-colored and bright in the spring sun, her hand resting on his shoulder. They had converted the barn into a sanctuary for veterans, a place where men could find the same peace that Thatcher had found among the apple trees. Coda lay in the grass at their feet, his silvered muzzle resting on his paws. He was 10 years old now, his joints warmed by the sun and his soul at rest. He didn't need to sing anymore, but every now and then he would look toward the north ridge and give a soft, knowing huff. The magnetic compass Liam had left behind sat on the mantel inside, its needle now pointing true north, stable and calm. Thatcher looked at his hands, which were still scarred and calloused, but they no longer shook. He realized that the golden bough wasn't just a tree or a mineral singularity. It was the capacity for a broken man to grow again. As the sun dipped behind the Flathead Range, painting the peaks in shades of fire and hope, Thatcher reached down and scratched Coda behind the ears. The mission was finally complete. They were home,